It's really good to be here. As you just heard, I've spoken before at SLA events, particularly in America, actually. So it's nice to be doing one here and on my home turf, and it's particularly nice to be doing one here in the FT building, because I'm sure that many of you know that the FT is a part owner of the Economist group, and so it feels like I've come to speak at my parents' house. For those of you who are not clear who the EIU is or what the EIU is, we're the business-to-business arm of the Economist group. So the Economist, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. It's our consumer publication. We sell about 1.5 million copies a week. We have some other consumer businesses too, because we own a lifestyle magazine, which is particularly Economist. It certainly isn't competing with Vogue, but nonetheless, if you're interested, we have a magazine called Intelligent Life that sits alongside the Economist and talks about what to do in your spare time. We work in the EIU, though, in a different sphere. We work with businesses and governments and not-for-profit organisations and help them think about what's going on around the world. And what I want to do this morning is give you a bit of a teaser of what we think might be happening in 2013. I look after content, so I'm the editorial director, so I have a team of people who do country and industry forecasting, and I've tried to tease from that some of the really big issues that we think we'll all be thinking about, and I'll just present that to you, but in a relatively light way. I'm not going to use any graphs. I probably won't use any numbers, which is very unusual for an economist, and what I will use is pictures instead. So we're going to take it nice and easy for the next 20 minutes and only use graphics. We're going to start with a slide which is, I think, we really welcome for most non-economists who, rather than analysing what's going on around the world at the moment, actually have to work in it. And this sense that the slowdown, recession that we've seen in the global economy, which really broke in middle of 2007, seems almost endless, that we just go on with this litany of bad news. And I will probably repeat that over the next 20 minutes as well, although there are some better things to say perhaps towards the end of 2013. Why does it feel so relentlessly awful, and has it been so relentlessly awful for such a long time? Well, I think it is important to recognise that we are in the process of recovering from a financially driven recession, a balance sheet recession, as economists say, and those are fundamentally different from the sorts of recessions that most of you will have become used to over your working careers, the sort where inflation picks up and central banks raise interest rates and we have a downturn and then they kickstart a recovery. Recessions which are driven by problems in the financial sector and over-borrowing in other parts of the economy traditionally take a very long time to recover from. We've done a little bit of analysis looking at performance of economies recovering from previous financial crises, and whereas in a normal recession by 3 years in you would expect growth to be roaring ahead, in a financial recession of the sort that we're seeing at the moment, 3 years in you would still expect to be going backwards, and that's pretty much what we are seeing today. So I guess the problems that we have around the world may feel relentless, and I can't give you any cheer around that apart from to say it's exactly what you would have expected to see given what was going on in the global economy in the run-up to 2007. Nonetheless, it's not all doom and gloom. 2013 may feel pretty difficult, but actually I think it will be a little bit better than 2012 was, primarily because of China and to a lesser extent because of America. Both of those parts of the world we think will do modestly better next year than this year. Unfortunately, the markets which are closest to home, those of Europe and the UK, will still feel pretty tough. But certainly when you look at 2013 as a whole, we think it will be modestly better than the previous year has been, but mainly because of things that are happening in places far away from here. I want to start looking around the global economy by actually focusing on Europe. And I guess it's inevitable that that would be the case given that all the problems that we're facing in Europe at the moment. So a couple of pointers. First of all, people talk a lot about the Eurozone crisis. Now, is 2013 the year that the Euro will fall apart altogether? I think it's important to recognise, before we focus on whether there's a crisis to come, that Europe has already had a crisis, and a pretty marked one. And when you look at economies operating within the Eurozone, some of them, since the start of this financial crisis we saw in 2007, have seen their living standards move backwards very, very significantly. There's news this morning about Greece again in protests, political unrest. Greece has seen a 20% decline in living standards over the course of the last 5 years or so. Markets like Spain and Portugal and Italy have seen their living standards slide back by 10% or so. So for those markets, crisis has already occurred. The question in 2013 is there going to be another one? Now, our view is that in 2013, we will not see a breakup of the Eurozone. So we don't think any countries will leave, not even Greece. And I would say that Greece is the closest, but we don't believe anyone will leave the Eurozone. But what we do believe is that the euro, as it is currently constructed, is not long-run sustainable. And the picture that I have here, my colleagues in the Economist magazine put this together, just shows the work that will have to happen within the eurozone if we're going to turn what at the moment is a very unstable currency union into something that can survive in the long term. We need to see many things. Fiscal union is written there very large. I think the problems that we see in terms of achieving banking sector union, single regulator, bailout, cross-border bailout, the banking area, those things are going to be front and centre of a debate in the eurozone over the course of the next 12 months. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not very optimistic that European leaders are going to be capable of making the political decisions necessary to make the eurozone sustainable in the long term. So when I look out 5 or 6 years, I'm very worried that the euro will not exist in the form it is today. But I certainly think enough has been done to get us through the next 12 months in one piece, largely by the European Central Bank. And so I think from your perspective, expect lots of volatility, lots of very uncomfortable headlines, lots of disappointment about political action to put the long-term reforms in place which are needed to keep the Eurozone on the road. But I think it's wrong to expect Europe to disintegrate entirely, or the Eurozone to disintegrate entirely during the course of the next 12 months or so. Now, moving from there to the US economy and thinking about the sorts of issues that we'll be facing in America over the course of the next 12 months or so, well, I guess the first thing to point out is that we will have, we've just had an election. So I guess under new circumstances, you would expect a new political settlement, perhaps a new president, certainly a new look and feel to Congress. Of course, we don't actually have any of that. We had an election. It was very fractious, really violently argued, tremendous divisions within the country, and we ended up with the president that we had before, and the House and the Senate being controlled by the parties that were controlling them previously. So you could argue that there's been absolutely no change at all. Now, I would say that actually there has, behind the scenes, been some change. The most important thing which has changed in the US political system over the course of the election is, of course, that Barack Obama will not be running again. And Barack Obama not running again removes at least one of the reasons why the Republican Party was so antagonistic to passing any policy measures that the White House believed were important over the course of the last 4 years. They were trying to stymie the possibility that he would be re-elected for a second term. That possibility has now come true, but he will not be running again, and so we believe that does, at the margins, mean that the opportunity for political agreement around some of the bigger issues facing the US has improved. Perhaps the big short-term issue is what we call the fiscal cliff. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there are a series of laws in place at the moment in America, many of which were passed some time ago, even 10 years ago, which collectively will mean that fiscal policy will tighten very sharply in the first few months of 2013 unless something specific is done to stop that. Much higher taxes, a much lower public spending. Politicians at the moment do not agree on taking action to alleviate that sort of baked-in-the-cake fiscal tightening. At the moment, you see tremendous friction within Congress and between Congress and the White House. But our belief is that one of the things which the advent of the election makes possible is that we will actually see some measures put in place to mean that the fiscal cliff is avoided, and that during the course of the next 3 months or so, you will see policies put in place to mean that taxes rise on the rich but are kept low on the middle income, and that the spending cuts that were currently penciled in will be pushed out much further through the political cycle and will not all occur in the next few months. And as a result of that, America will avoid the very wrenching fiscal shock which currently is legally baked into the cake and would be sufficient to drive America into recession. So fiscal cliff, we think that we will avoid that. In terms of the economy more broadly, we do see a very slow and rather lacklustre recovery in place. If you look at the housing market, we see more housing starts happening now, so more ground being broken on new construction sites than has been the case for quite a considerable period. If you look at financial stresses within America, we see that households have actually made quite a bit of progress in dealing with the big debt overhang that they built up during the bubble years, not particularly because households have been saving very diligently and paying off credit card debt or mortgages, but actually what you've seen is tremendous mortgage defaults in the US economy, which has meant that households have basically pushed the financial problems that they face off their balance sheet and onto the financial system. That, of course, is a terrible problem for the financial system, but it means that for individuals, some of the balance sheet strains that they were facing over the course of the last couple of years have disappeared, and now they're in a better position to think about taking on new credit and starting to spend going forwards. And that, of course, is not a situation that we see in Europe. But nonetheless, when we look at America, despite the fact that we think that growth will be a little bit stronger next year and certainly rather better than Europe, I think it's important to recognise that America, in our view, has changed quite markedly from the very dynamic economy that we thought it was 5 or 10 years ago. The US has an ageing population, maybe not ageing as rapidly as places like Japan and Italy, but nonetheless it is ageing, and that's going to be a particular burden to America because their healthcare system is so expensive. And US, as you see people ageing, their demands on healthcare systems become greater. The US is not very well equipped to pay for that. So that's a problem that will need to be addressed through longer-term fiscal reform, and at the moment we don't see a lot of appetite for taking that on. We also see in America a long-term unemployment problem of the sort that we haven't seen in the US before. The average person who doesn't have a job in the US right now has been out of work for about 40 weeks. That's nearly 9 months. That's a point at which people find it very difficult to reintegrate into the labour force. So we worry that the US is developing some of the economic problems that perhaps we more generally associate with Europe. And we also see some signs that US productivity growth perhaps is a bit slower than it used to be. US is a very innovative economy. You see firms undertaking an enormous amount of R&D activity. But the fruits of that R&D activity seem to, certainly financially, wash out on the balance sheets of American companies, but economically often seem to appear on the GDP statistics of countries elsewhere around the world. And if you think of a country like Apple, for example, of a company like Apple, of course Apple, one of the largest companies in the world, extraordinarily profitable on the back of the tremendous innovative activity they've had around the iPad and the iPhone. But of course the manufacturing activity which goes into making those services actually accrues to other countries, particularly China, so that you see a dichotomy between the innovative activity which is driving corporate profits in America and the way that that's washing out economically, which is a much more broad geographic focus, which is of course making it difficult for the heartland of America to find jobs as the economy recovers, because a lot of those jobs, of course, are more attractively sourced from overseas. Moving from America to China, and I think China, for quite a long time, you'll have been reading a lot of economic stories about China slowing down and increasing worries about how China is being affected by the problems that we see in America and Europe. More recently, we've seen some much better data, and our view is that the Chinese economy is turning around, and that's because we see a lot more domestic strength in China than we saw before. The problems of them not being able to sell as much as they would like to America and Europe still remain, but you see stronger domestic demand in China, partly because of things that are happening in the private sector, but also because of things that the government has been doing. The government has been rather more ambitious of late in terms of their fiscal expansion plans, their pump priming plans for the Chinese economy, than has been the case over the course of the previous 18 months or so, and we think that's going to have an effect, and by next year we imagine a Chinese economy could be going by 8.5% or so, so quite a bit faster than this past year, and certainly fast enough, I think, to allay worries that China is heading into a period of prolonged difficult growth. Now, I think in China, the really interesting story next year, though, will not be the fact that it's recovering, because I think that will very quickly be just assumed to be normal. I think the much more interesting story is where that recovery is happening. A lot of Chinese growth over the course of the last 5 or 6 years has been in the coastal areas, in the big cities along the coast. That's where incomes are higher. That's where spending power is greatest. That's where a lot of Western businesses are still making a lot of their revenue. But over the course of the next couple of years or so, and even in the course of 2013, we expect to see more of the economic activity in China shifting inland, with more and more cities in the interior of the country seeing a generalised rise in living standards, higher incomes, and therefore becoming a much more attractive market for both Western firms and local Chinese firms as well. So I think the really interesting story next year will not be the recovery in China, but will be where that recovery is happening, and the fact that recovery is happening in cities that currently most Western firms fear to tread. Now, that recovery is going to benefit Western businesses that try to operate in China, but also it benefits, and most greatly benefits, Chinese firms. Chinese firms derive in tremendous economies of scale from that very large local market. Those economies of scale equip them very well to start to do business overseas. And that's what this graphic is all about. That increasingly now, Chinese firms are not only interested in competing for their local market, but are also interested in competing on international markets as well. Now, many of you may think that that means Chinese firms are interested in moving into other emerging markets in Asia or sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, and you read a lot about that, Chinese firms trying to buy raw materials, commodities in those places. But actually, I think the really interesting story about Chinese firms is how they want to compete in the world's most developed and richest markets in industries which are generally viewed as being the preserve of the world's largest and most powerful companies. And just as an example, over the course of the next 12 months, we expect to see 4 of the biggest Chinese automotive manufacturers make a play for entering the Western European car market. So I think you should expect to see in the next 12 months Great Wall Motors, Chery, Geely, Beijing Automotive, all attempting to take a slice of the European car market. So don't be fooled into thinking that Chinese firms venturing overseas only venture overseas in low value added or commodity based industries. We believe that over the course of the next few years, increasingly Chinese firms will be competing against major Western players in markets that previously were viewed as being off limits for emerging market firms. And then just finally, to think about other places in the world that we ought to consider next year. I'm just going to run through a few. That picture there is, of course, of Africa. Africa we view as being a really interesting bright spot. Over the past couple of decades or so, most Western firms have ignored Africa. They viewed it as being too difficult, income levels are too low, business environment is very tough. Now, many of those things are still true in many countries, but increasingly now we do see the emergence of a middle class in many economies in sub-Saharan Africa, and that middle class is making those markets more attractive for Western businesses to get in there and do business. So we expect to see a lot more interest in places like Nigeria, places like Ghana, places like Kenya over the course of the next few years, even places like Ethiopia, as firms increasingly see these as being the new frontier markets where they can be profitable. I mean, in the Middle East, I think it's important to recognise that the kind of turmoil that we're seeing at the moment may ultimately lead to a long-run, much more attractive political settlement, but at the moment is meaning that that market is very difficult for Western firms, and so problems in Syria, concerns about Iran, those markets are very wobbly, and that's tainting views about the rest of the region. In Asia, many economies in Asia are just hanging on China's coattails. The strength of China will drag up Southeast Asian economies as well, ASEAN, Indonesia, Malaysia and the like. India is an economy which could be so successful, but unfortunately in our view, policy-wise, has got it wrong, and therefore we believe next year will perhaps be rather disappointing. Latin America, similarly, the really big economy there is Brazil. Again, could be fantastic, is perennially talked about as the economy of tomorrow, but unfortunately that's usually followed by, and always will be. We were very optimistic that Brazil was going to do rather better. They seem to have broken out of some of the lethargy that we saw, but actually Brazil now seems to be sliding back into a period of perhaps rather ineffective policy making and disappointing performance. I think Mexico more interesting to watch right now. And in Eastern Europe, unfortunately being hammered by the problems of Western Europe, and by and large, with some exceptions, I think Poland rather stronger, we're seeing a rather disappointing and difficult performance for many Eastern European economies. I guess because we're talking about 2013 specifically, it's useful just to wrap up with a view about what's going to be hot next year and what's not. So I put a couple of pictures up. I'll forgive you if the first one is difficult for you to interpret. What's that a picture of? It's a picture of someone digging a large amount of copper out of the ground, and actually it's a reference to the fact that we believe the fastest growing economy next year will be Mongolia, where Rio Tinto has just opened a really substantial mining operation which will be sufficient in our view to take the Mongolian economy forward by about 14% in real terms over the course of the next 12 months. Following on behind is Macau, still offering fantastic gambling services to the Chinese economy. We also think that Gambia, Angola will do well. Mozambique, Iraq because of raising oil production. So lots of difficult frontier markets there, emerging markets, many of them doing well because of commodity trade or recovering from political stresses we saw over the course of the previous few years. And then finally, at the bottom there, the worst performing economy in the world we expect next year will be Greece, You can see the earn just tottering on the edge, about to smash. We think Greece will shrink by 5% next year. I think that will mean it's a 7th consecutive year of economic contraction in that economy. And I think that while we don't believe that Greece will decide to exit the Eurozone, we absolutely do believe that the political stresses that you see in Greece will continue and even worsen over the course of the next few years. And then just more broadly than that, it's salutary to note that over the half of the worst performing countries in our bottom 10 next year are going to be Eurozone economies. And so while we think it's absolutely the emerging markets and some of those frontier markets which are most exciting, it is unfortunately the big industrial European economies which are very close to home for us in the UK, which will be the most worrying with the most difficult problems after years and years of difficulty already. So I think that's pretty much all I have to say.